Okay. Good morning, everyone. This is part 2 of our Making Sense of Child Sexual Abuse Prevention curricula. And Elizabeth just asked a really good question about how, especially with schools, like we have really limited time. And so how do we balance the school's request that we come in for like an hour and deliver something just like one time versus knowing that that's not really an effective way of doing prevention, but this is what the school is giving us. Like, so a few thoughts I have about that. One, and I'm not, you all know, like and maybe it's not you, maybe it's your manager or, whoever sort of handling the relationships that you have with schools and like doing the coordinating and scheduling and all that. But I do trust people's knowledge of the relationship they have with the school system. And if they are in a position to like push for more time or not. I know that schools have a million things they're trying to cram into a school year, and there are definitely going to be cases where they just will not give you more time. I also think sometimes we miss out because we just never ask, like we don't bring up the fact that coming in for like one session, especially one session where we're in front of like hundreds of kids in an assembly, which I know is something some folks have to do. We miss out by just not talking about how, yes, this is maybe going to fulfill your school requirement, your whatever, like, I think a lot of folks have sort of a checkbox of like, these are the things that we have to get done this year with our students. It'll meet that, but it's not really in the spirit of like, there will be less violence happening to your students because of this presentation. So it's worth asking and just trying to make the case for like, we really would love, even if they can only give you one more session, right? Even if we can bump it up to 2 as opposed to 1, like that is better. The other suggestions that I have are, one, to think about other places. I think schools have been like, this is how we do prevention. K through 12 schools and then colleges and universities have been the place for this forever. There's so many other ways. Like if we have programs we want to do with youth, there's a lot of other spaces that youth are in that might be happy to bring us in, like after school programs, youth service bureaus, camps. And I know some member centers do programs like this. So if anybody has any like examples they want to share, that's great. But I just think, thinking a little bit outside of just K through 12 schools, like where else do we have opportunities to get in front of young people? That's another possible solution. And then Elizabeth, just what you were saying about, and this is more work on your end. So, think about like what's realistic for you and your team, but also thinking about, okay, maybe we really are only going to get to go in one time and talk to these kids for an hour. What other materials, what you sort of mentioned, like lesson plan, like helping teachers with like, how can they reinforce this idea in their classroom after I'm gone? I think that's all stuff that it doesn't have to be complicated. I mean, it could be like, what's something that a teacher could hang up in the classroom that's going to like reinforce these messages? What's something that the school could put up in the hallways or in the bathrooms or in the locker rooms or whatever that's going to reinforce some of these messages? It's all, anything we can do to just like reiterate and reinforce is gonna be helpful. Yeah, but I do think we sometimes assume that we have less power than we do. Like, it's worth asking, can we come in for longer? This is really not going to work to only go in once, like, yeah. And definitely some of those like supporting materials and stuff. I don't have really good examples of that for you right now, but that's definitely something we can talk about more. And I'm happy to look around for more resources, like, how do you create things that could go in a classroom or in the hallway or be part of a teacher, like an activity that a teacher might do in a classroom or something like that. And thanks, Sarah, for the examples of all the other places where Safe Haven is working with young people. That's awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much for particularly that second point, that we can reach students through other means. Like it might be the same group of youth, but we don't necessarily have to be in the school to talk with them. And I know that the Rowan Center also goes to camps, and I'm still learning all the places we go, but that is comforting to know that that, of course, counts as a repeat interaction. It's not just, did we see them in that classroom multiple times? Thanks.
Yeah. And I think a lot of places, especially after school programs, camps, things like that, like a lot of these programs are functioning on not having a lot of resources themselves. And so depending on your funding and what you need to do, like you may have some limitations around that. But I have found that a lot of programs are like very excited to have someone come in multiple times, because they're a little bit like, yeah, we don't totally know what to do with this group of young people, like every day after school for however many weeks. Like, I think people are psyched to hear that there's another adult that would like to come in and do something. All right, I'm gonna just put the sign-in sheet in the chat, and then I'll pull up my slides again. We'll pick up where we left off last week. Okay. All right, so last week we covered, we covered these first like 3 bubbles over here. We spent a lot of time on this principles of prevention. I won't review all of this, but these are sort of the things we talked about, right? That these 9 principles of prevention are what make for effective prevention programming, especially as we think about programs that are sort of like education based, but maybe have other components as well. That's what that first piece about being comprehensive and varied teaching methods. So some of those things we were just talking about, like, can we have other ways of communicating these messages, reinforcing these messages in the classroom or in whatever space we're in? So we're going to pick up with, I wanted to just quickly go over, I think a lot of times when we're looking at a curricula or a curriculum, it might say that something is like evidence-based or evidence-informed or something like that. And it's helpful to know what that language actually means, because it's a little jargony. So, and you'll hear people talk about, oh, we want to do something that's evidence-based, right? So what does that actually mean? So what this language means, it's a little bit of like a spectrum of how much has something been evaluated. That's basically, and has it been evaluated and found that it is effective, and that over and over and over again, it is producing the same kind of positive results, or the same results that you'd hope for from a curriculum. So sort of at the most rigorously evaluated end of the spectrum is something will be referred to as evidence-based. So if something is evidence-based, that means that it has been researched and evaluated to demonstrate that it is effective, and that when it is implemented and evaluated, that we see the same positive outcomes over and over again. It likely means, this is really important, thinking about the different populations of students or the audiences we might be working with. It is likely been evaluated with a wide variety of types of, even if it's meant, maybe only meant for like a specific age group, but within that age group of people, we have evaluated this in like big public schools, or in smaller private schools, or in urban neighborhoods, more rural communities. Like, we've tested it in lots of different places. We found that the outcomes are pretty consistent across the board. We've had big sample sizes. We've tested it with a lot of students or a lot of people. So we are really confident that the outcomes that we are seeing are directly related to us using this curriculum, and that's what's creating some of these positive changes. And it's based on a theory. So we talked about last week some of the different like public health theories and models, or behavioral theories and models that are out there. And so this is a curriculum that is based on one of those theories, and then it has been tested. So this is sort of the if you can find a curricula that is evidence-based, that's like the gold standard. You should feel pretty confident that it's going to accomplish some positive things. Evidence-informed means the curriculum is based on a theory, like it has a strong theoretical foundation, like it's based on one of those models or theories, and it has been evaluated. People have implemented it and tested it and said, yep, it produces some positive outcomes, but it just doesn't meet quite the same standards as something that is evidence-based. So it's possible that it hasn't been evaluated as many times, or maybe with big groups of people or across many different populations. So this is still a good curriculum. It's still, you can expect that something positive will come out of it. But one thing that we want to pay attention to is if we look at a curriculum and we can look at, you can oftentimes find either within the, like on the curriculum website, or sort of within some of the materials from that, or if you just Google it, articles that talk about like, oh, here's the study where we evaluated this curriculum. It is worth checking those things out, again, to look for who did they test this with? Did they test it with like a really specific type of population? And is that population similar to the one that I'm thinking I would use this curriculum with? That's where one of the differences between evidence-based and evidence-informed is that evidence-informed, maybe they only tested it with students of a particular gender, or it was only tested with students all from middle-class families or something like that, right? When we so if you purchase a curriculum or you're working with a curriculum that is evidence-based, it's meeting this like highest level, and we sometimes will modify curriculum, right? Because we're saying like, oh, this example, this activity, this whatever doesn't feel like as relevant when, maybe the curriculum was made 5 years ago. This no longer feels that relevant. We're going to like tailor some things to be more in line with the population we're working with right now. Technically, I'm not saying this is a big deal, but technically that might mean the curriculum is more evidence informed because we're not following it like exactly to the letter that it was written. But again, it's still good. It's still going to likely have very positive outcomes. And then the other phrase that you might see on curriculum out there is just theory driven, which means it's based on a theory. There's like logically and based on the the information we have about people's behavior and public health stuff and all that, it's very likely that this curriculum is effective, but it hasn't been evaluated enough to really prove that it is. So that's sort of at the lower end of sort of standards of evidence that you might see, but it's it's based in something good, and it might work. This is where if you're using something that is theory driven as opposed to either of these other two options, you would want to be evaluating this yourself while you're doing it to see like, are we having the kind of outcomes we're hoping for? Anybody have any questions about any of this? All right. Okay, so the next section is all about more specific content. So this comes from I know I sent you all in the follow-up, like from last week, an article that went over all of the principles of prevention. This content, this is not specifically from the CDC. This is what I found from, I think, the Wisconsin Coalition. So the Wisconsin version of the Alliance. They did a bunch of research where they looked at all of these different curricula out there and which ones are having some positive outcomes when it comes to CSA prevention. What are the topics they're actually talking about? So this is sort of like a compilation of lots of different topics that could be covered in a curricula, and sort of why some of these things work. I'm actually not going to get into the why a ton right now because it's just a lot of information for you all, but I can send you the article that this is all pulled from, and there's more like justification in all of that. Oh yeah, so this is sort of what I was just saying. Research on risk and protective factors for sexual violence and other effective strategies for preventing child sexual abuse. And so they came up with 10 content areas that could or should be part of prevention programming. So the first one is sexual health and development. And I will say a lot of these content areas, I don't think it's reasonable for you all to integrate like all 10 of these in really, really robust ways into probably any program that you're doing. It's just a lot of information. I think the takeaway that is more useful for you all from this section is just, are we doing some of these things? We should feel pretty good if we're doing some of these things, right? And some of them are not like I actually think this one, sexual health and development, I know that you all we're not like sex ed teachers. That's not your role when you're going into classrooms, even though you're probably doing some of that, especially with older students. It's more about, like, I think this first piece, using anatomically correct names for body parts, right? Like being able to talk to kids in a way that is comfortable, you feel comfortable talking about this, and just reinforcing that it's good for us to know the correct names, or like somebody's version of correct names for body parts, so that we can talk about these things. Some of the other components about this, again, some of this is hopefully being covered more by like the health classes in the schools that you might be going to. Age and developmentally appropriate sexual development. So this is, when we think about how schools talk to young kids about puberty and stuff like that, that's a protective factor for sexual violence. And then evidence-based sexual health information, just young people having access to accurate sexual health information is also protective against sexual violence. So not that this is all on you, but just good to know that this is useful information for youth. Another content area is gender socialization, and I think this is something many of you probably are doing. So challenging gender-based stereotypes. We talked a little bit last week about masculinity and conversations we might have with young people around just stereotypes, things that they think they must do or they have to do because of their gender. All of that, like breaking down some of those stereotypes and myths and challenging people to think a little differently, all of that is really useful in preventing child sexual abuse, as well as just supporting all gender identities and young people's exploration and understanding of their own gender identity. The next one, I think we got a good example from Eleanor of how they're doing this at the Y last week, intersections of oppression. So promoting respect and understanding for all cultures and identities in the classroom, exploring concepts of self-identity and privilege, and then just broadly like inclusivity and intersectionality in how we talk about things. So Eleanor gave the example last week of doing like a land acknowledgement and being really deliberate in approaching conversations about sexual violence from like an anti-racist lens. However we can do this with, I know, thinking about young people, like the language we use might be really different, but communicating that not only is sexual violence, like sexual violence is an issue of racism and of homophobia and transphobia and all those other things, right? Like we can probably have some of those conversations with older students, but just our own approach in the classroom of being inclusive and intersectional and encouraging young people to think about their own identities and where they fall, especially when it comes to privilege. This is one I think all of us are probably doing and very, very comfortable doing, is talking about boundaries. So one important point, I know this has come up in other trainings we've done, is that when we teach about touching, and I know folks have probably heard me say that we are trying to move away from the like good touch, bad touch binary, or like telling kids to sort of categorize like these are all the examples of like bad kinds of touches or unsafe kinds of touches. And these are examples of good touches, because we just know that especially for young people, it can be really, really confusing, especially if they experience some form of sexual abuse. Like not all touch feels bad, right? Like it could feel confusing. It could feel like a lot of different things, right? And so we know that categorizing things like that isn't super helpful for kids. But we can talk about touching sort of on more of a continuum and talk to young people about their own boundaries and what are they okay with and what are they not okay with. How to self-advocate when boundaries get crossed. Again, not because we expect young people to protect themselves from adults or from older kids, or, you know, we know that young people, it's not their responsibility to protect themselves from experiencing sexual abuse, but it is really good practice for young people to know how to advocate about lots of different kinds of boundaries, even if that's just, you know, my friend told another person something about me and I didn't like it, right? Like that, talking about boundaries like that. So how to set and respect boundaries. So we're also, you know, talking about how to respect other people's boundaries. That's another important skill. And then talking about affirmative consent. And I know many of us are really good at thinking about how we can talk about consent with younger people as well. This is obviously really broad consent across lots of different kinds of activities, not just sexual activities. So all of this is super, super useful, protective against CSA. If folks need me to pause or have any questions or anything at any point, just feel free to jump in. I know I'm kind of moving quickly.
I do actually have a question about the boundaries, just
Sure.
for everyone in the group. Like, has anyone taught about consent to pre-K kindergarten age kids? Okay, yeah, Sarah, can you speak to it a little bit? I've had to run like 2 sessions, and I'm doing like weekly sessions at the Y, and I've had a really hard time with it, mostly because our curriculum is for more like a 2nd grade age, and I'm getting a little bit lost as to like how to, like, we're basing it on a book that we're reading with them, but the book is pretty advanced for their age and they don't seem to be getting anything from the lesson. But it's also like me coming in one time and like all these things that we've been talking about, and they're just like crawling all over me, and I'm like, okay, this is not what we're trying to teach. But I don't know, do you have any advice or tips, or like how do you go about teaching boundaries or consent at that age?
So what I will say for kids who are like probably 1st grade and younger, when you're doing consent stuff, is that it needs to be repetitive. Like it's not going to happen in a one-time visit. So I would encourage you to talk to the teachers, like what are they already doing in the classroom to teach about boundaries and consent? Because they probably are already doing things like we keep our hands to ourselves, we don't hug our friends at school. Some schools have rules where like they're not supposed to hug at school, things like that. A book that we use, I haven't actually used it with pre-K, but I use it with kindergarten, and I think it would be fine for pre-K, is called Your Body Belongs to You. It is very much designed for like really young kids. And it repeats a lot. Your body belongs to you. If you don't like the way someone is touching you, like you can ask that person to stop. You can ask a grown-up to help you ask them, etc. And I'm not in my office, but I can send you the title and the author of that book if that's something you guys are interested in. The other thing that I do, and I think you have mentioned that you do this with your little elephant puppet, but I bring a Beanie Baby to every school. And for the little ones, this was pre-COVID, but I give them an opportunity to ask the Beanie Baby if they want a hug or a pet. And we go over like how this is going to work. Like, you need to come up here if you want to. You need to ask Frank's permission to give him a hug or a pet, whichever one you want. And then you need to wait for Frank to answer you. And like what you will probably find is that for each kid in line, you have to reiterate those instructions when it's their turn, because they will not remember. The last thing is whenever a kid comes like running at me and they're like, "Oh, Miss Sarah," I stop them. I'm like, wait, can you ask permission first? I make them ask me for a hug. I never say no, because I think if a kid wants a hug, they need some kind of affection and attention from an adult. So I make them ask me first, and then I give them like a sideways cousin hug.
Yeah.
But that the repetition for the teeny tinies is very important.
Yeah, that's
The classroom multiple times and do that stuff with them. That's probably the most effective way to do that.
okay. Yeah, and I'm gonna be doing like a professional development training with all of the pre-K teachers, where I'm gonna say like, you know, this is what we came in to do. This was our intention. And like with this book, with this curriculum, and here's how you can continue to implement it, and have a discussion of like exactly what you were saying, like what are the ways you're already doing this, because they understand what are rules. So clearly the teachers are implementing rules in the classroom. And then we were going to also give like stuff to have the parents, like information for parents to also like just continue this messaging, and maybe like a list of books for them too. But oh, thank you, Elizabeth. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that advice. That's really helpful.
Sorry, I'm using a laptop that I don't normally use, and I don't know how to use it. The last thing I will say, when you speak to the teachers, encouraging them to model asking for consent. So I know with pre-K especially, like it's kind of different standards for like a older teacher. Like I've seen teachers pick up a kid and put them on their lap, or like give them a hug, or like kind of cradle them, or like carry them around the classroom. But reminding them that it's important for them to ask the kids permission too, so that they're seeing a grown-up do that, but they're also getting the message like in affirming people should ask me for my permission before they touch me.
I wonder too, Eleanor, when you meet with the group of teachers, like what other ideas they might have. Like I think when you ask them sort of like, what are you already doing in your classroom, or like, you know, tell me a little bit about what consent looks like when you're with your students. I wonder what other ideas they'll have, just because I think so much of all the stuff that Sarah said around like being repetitive and needing to just make it super, super clear, probably 20 times, makes a ton of sense. And the teachers might have other ideas too about how you can get this information like most effectively into their brains.
Yeah, I'll let you guys know what they say. If that would be helpful. Like if anything is like, oh, okay, I didn't think of it this way, I can email that out and to see if that would be helpful for anyone else, you know.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. I also want to say, I think the Don't Hug Doug book is really great. The one that Elizabeth put in the chat. All right. So the next content area goes really right in line with what we were just talking about. So empowerment and bodily autonomy. So helping young people understand that like their body belongs to them, exactly what many of the books and lessons that we're teaching hopefully are communicating. So the Wisconsin Coalition, they had this piece in there about public versus private parts of the body. I don't love the framing of this, but I don't know what is a better, if anybody is talking about this in a different way, please share it. I do think it's useful for kids to have an understanding of like generally what are considered private parts of the body. It just feels weird to me to frame any body part as being public, because to me that implies that like, oh, anybody could touch it at any time and it's totally fine. And like, I don't want someone to touch my head or whatever. So I don't know if anybody's doing this differently, but giving kids an understanding, especially when it comes to asking adults for help, not keeping secrets. I know that's another topic that a lot of folks talk about to prevent CSA, that like we shouldn't keep secrets, especially about people touching private body parts. Like we can always tell an adult about that. But also along with this is just decision making about our own body and empowerment and assertiveness with setting boundaries and deciding what feels good to you and what doesn't. The next one, I think very, very common in many of the curricula that we probably have looked at, is pro-social behavior and skills. So a lot of this is stuff that it doesn't necessarily feel like, oh, this is directly related to like preventing sexual violence. This is just like skills of how to be a good and healthy person in the world. But it is protective against sexual violence, also in thinking about how young people relate to each other and like, you know, the kind of adults that they grow up to be, and how to respect other people's boundaries and have less violence in our own lives. So skills like communication, empathy, problem solving, resolving conflicts without violence, impulse control is a really big one. And skills and tools for self-regulation and helping young people calm down, helping young people think before they act, like all of this social emotional learning stuff that I know some of us are doing and certainly shows up in a lot of curricula. Another piece, and this is, I think, there are not probably a ton of published curricula out there. The Miss Kendra project, which I think if you go to prevention meetings, you probably heard me talk about like once before, is a curriculum that is very focused on trauma. I think this might not necessarily feel like it fits in terms of your content that you're talking to young people about, but I do think us, you know, all of you as educators having like a trauma-informed approach to delivering curriculum and being in relationship with young people also fits in really nicely with this content area. But there are curricula out there that are more focused on being able to talk about trauma, being able to identify it, creating environments that encourage disclosure of different kinds of trauma, which I know all of you are doing, and then providing resources for not only anybody who might disclose, but also for the staff and the other adults that are interacting with young people. Do they know how to respond appropriately? Bystander intervention. Oh, Sarah, I'm just looking at your comment about, yeah, the SEL lessons and talking about the amygdala. That's awesome. Yeah, all of that is really, really useful. I think there's, I know I used to do second step, which is a lot of social emotional learning stuff. And there's not a ton in there that I don't know that there's anything in there other than like a specific curriculum they have for, I think, K-5 kids, but with their middle school stuff, there's like nothing that is like specifically about sexual violence, but all of those skills are still protective and preventative of sexual violence, because it's all, yeah, that's just what research shows us. So the next one is bystander intervention. I'm sure we're all somewhat familiar with this idea. The big takeaway with bystander intervention is that it includes skills practice. So we talked about the importance of practicing skills last week. This is really, really important for bystander intervention, that if we're going to talk to people about how could you step in to keep somebody else safe, or just to, you know, go get an adult or somebody else to try to deal with a situation, that we want to give people practice in actually saying those things and doing those things in different scenarios. The other piece around bystander intervention, the third point on here, is just sort of this general promotion of the idea that we have responsibility, both to think about how am I treating other people, but also like what's going on in my community and how are people treating one another around me. That's sort of the other piece of this.
I have 2 comments on this piece, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So one is when one of my colleagues and I taught bystander intervention for middle schoolers, we had our other colleague, we orchestrated a scenario, and we had her trip and fall and spill papers everywhere. And at the beginning of the lesson, not even before we were talking about bystander intervention, and none of the kids helped. And then we kept referring back to that example and showed them in real time, and then I had a discussion about it, what was the impulse for you to not help? Did you see it happen? Some kids didn't see it, some kids did see it. We kind of tricked them into this fake scenario. But I thought it ended up being very effective, and they were all like, what? When they realized it was one of them was like, I knew it was fake, that's why I didn't help. And I was like, yeah, right. But the other piece of it is recently I went to this other training or another presentation about bystander intervention. And the message and the takeaway was that, kind of to your last point, Kelsey, that it's about self-empowerment and self-understanding and knowledge. And you have to have trust in yourself before you can be an outward bystander or an active bystander. Or it was the presentation was the difference between a bystander and an upstander kind of thing. And we did this activity of write down words that are I'm kind of forgetting what it was, but it was write down words that build you up. So then when you need to act, you can remember that you are strong. And I just had never seen it framed that way, but I really liked that.
Mm-hmm.
That empowerment piece to bystander intervention, because we forget how hard it is to act and how small you feel in those moments, I think. So those were the 2 things on my mind with this.
Yeah, I love that. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Elizabeth.
And as a follow-up to what Eleanor said about writing down words that build you up, I've also heard that it's effective to write down scenarios in which you were successful. So, and that applies for adults too. When did I succeed at asking a question or letting someone know I felt uncomfortable, or I did something hard and I was successful, basically anything along those lines. And then having a little jar that you can pull from, a note to remind oneself that you've done it before, you can do it again. So I don't know, now I'm just kind of improvising here, but maybe there could be a place in the classroom where either people submit examples of when they've succeeded, or when it's done in the classroom, maybe the teacher can acknowledge it and add it to some kind of list as affirmations for the group that someone is stepping up, or great, thank you for that example. This is exactly what we're talking about. This is what we want to have modeled in the classroom. I'm going to put that here as an example of what I'd like to see more of, or, how did that feel to do it? How did it feel to be the recipient of the help when you drop the papers? I don't know, maybe it doesn't need to be public. Again, I haven't tested these ideas, I just thought of them. But building them up with proof that they have the skills already.
That in particular, I think, depending on whatever people are comfortable with, I actually do think some sort of, whether it's like written up on the wall somewhere or it's just verbally, whatever, I think like public acknowledgement of that was a really good thing that this person just did. That is the culture that I want to create in this classroom. Like that is right in line with everything we're talking about right now. Like reinforcing and supporting people that are being brave and acting as a bystander, like stepping in or whatever it is. That's really great. And I also love, Eleanor, that in the activity that you shared about, that you talk to the students about like why some of them didn't intervene, or like what were they thinking about, what were they feeling that made them not want to step in and help, even for like kind of an innocuous situation. Like there's no judgment associated with like helping someone pick up papers, I don't think, where there is in like calling out somebody who's being sexist or crossing someone's boundaries or whatever. Like that's an even harder situation. But it's important to acknowledge that we don't all step in all the time, that there's like stuff that gets in the way. All of us, adults included, like experience barriers to intervening. Like talking about that and acknowledging that is part of, I think, like doing effective bystander intervention, because we can't just go in with the message of like, well, I've taught you how to do it, so now you're going to do it all the time, right? Like that's not realistic. And it's okay to communicate to people like we're human beings and we screw up sometimes, and that's okay. Like let's think about how we could be more successful in the future. So that's a great like accompanying piece to the activity you all talked about. Great. All right, I think there's maybe two more. So information about sexual abuse, or sexual violence, or whatever language you want to use. This is, I think, a lot of this is probably included in some of your work already. The one piece that I know at the Alliance, we're like really trying to encourage schools and other institutions that work with young people or work with parents to give out more information about grooming. And this does not mean that you need to be talking to middle schoolers about grooming. Like, again, I think it's, think about who's the right audience for this information and like whose responsibility is it to know this. But this is a big, I don't feel like our movement has always done a great job talking about like, what are the warning signs that an adult or potentially even an older child or teenager like is grooming someone or is preparing to like abuse somebody. So that's important to talk about. This first point, facts and clear explanations about sexual abuse and sexual violence, I think you all are doing, and I know doing it in whatever feels like the age appropriate way for who you're working with, and dispelling common myths about sexual violence and abuse. We talked about last week how breaking people's myths about sexual violence, like that, that people often lie, or that sexual violence often is super, super violent and done by somebody that is a stranger. Like dispelling some of those myths is preventative. And the last one is safety and risk reduction. And I know that this idea of risk reduction or harm reduction in the sexual violence world, like when you think about strategies that people used to use to talk to people about sexual, like, oh, don't go walk around by yourself, don't get drunk, pay attention to your drink, like all that kind of stuff, like does sort of fall into this category of risk reduction, but is also very victim blaming. So we're not trying to do that. There is a place, it is appropriate for us, especially with young people, to talk about things like identifying trusted adults in their life, and who could you talk to if something happened to you, how could you say it to them, all of that kind of stuff. Not because, again, we're putting the the responsibility on the children in this situation, but just because this is like a good thing that kids need, right? They need to know who they trust and how they could talk to someone. And there aren't a lot of curricula out there. Like, I think when we talk about sexual abuse with young people, it is often paired with other, I don't know, I can think of a curricula I looked at once where it was like, first, we're going to talk about things like, why do we wear a helmet when we ride a bike? Or like, why do I wear a seatbelt in the car? Like all these other sort of safety, this is all framed as like a safety thing. And so thinking about situations where adults are going to do things to keep us safe, or there's things that we're going to do to keep ourselves safe. Like, I think that's why this general safety recommendations is often like an introduction. And then maybe we're going to talk about thinking about our bodies and boundaries and what feels safe or unsafe to us.
Do you think that a safety recommendation that isn't victim blaming would be something along the lines of it's important to be aware of your environment, as opposed to don't go out at night or carry keys between your fingernail, between your knuckle, like to just say being aware is good?
I think depending on like what the context is and like how old the people are, like I think obviously, you know, for all of us, like being aware of what's going on around us is like a safety recommendation that could have nothing to do with sexual violence, right? It's just like, oh, are my friends doing something that feels really unsafe to me? Like that's okay. I think it's okay to talk to young people about that.
So that would fall under that first bullet.
Yeah.
If it's broad enough that we're not saying brace yourself for sexual violence, just through awareness, you might notice that something feels off in any sense, and you might be able to remove yourself from that situation before something happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. Do other folks have thoughts about that?
We talk about listening to your gut with kids, like especially our older kids, but we'll use, I'll just throw the question out, like, have you ever like been somewhere or doing something with people and something just didn't feel right? And almost all the kids like raise their hands, so like, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. And so just encouraging them, like, listen to that feeling. If you have like an instinct, like this doesn't feel right, this doesn't feel good, like listen to it and do something about it. Haven't done it so much with little kids. I run into this a lot when doing our like sexual abuse prevention for like kindergarten, first grade, is they will take it and just spin it into like kidnapping and abductions, which is always, it's like a little mind-blowing to me, but it absolutely makes sense with what they're taught of like stranger danger. And we just kind of bring it back to like you were saying, the general safety, like, should you ever go anywhere with a grown-up who you don't know? Like, and they know the answer. But just like, I forgot where I was going with that.
It sounds, Sarah, like it's a little more concrete for the younger kids versus as opposed to like with older kids, you know, you can say stuff like you know, listen to your gut, or like think about like what is your body telling you right now, like does this feel okay or not feel okay? Whereas I think with younger kids, like it's you almost have to spell it out for them more, because I think for little kids, like I don't know at what age you can start being like, oh, I'm listening to my gut and it's telling me that but for like a 4 or 5-year-old, that's probably really hard to as a concept and to actually do, right?
You're taking me back to elementary school. At least at that time, the curriculum was about the uh-oh feeling. So at least there was an assumption that a young child would know when something feels like icky in the stomach or uh-oh. And then, and you know, like as Sarah said, encouraging them to think about that. But I don't know if that's someone's theory or evidence-based that kids of that age experience it that way and have an awareness of it.
This past year, I co-facilitated with Matt from Susan B. Anthony, and they have like a little puppet show thing that they do all about the uh-oh feeling. And they do a really nice job of giving examples that kids can probably relate to help them identify what the uh-oh feeling is. I think the example they use is like the puppet knocked over like a glass of milk, and then they felt like, uh-oh, like is mom gonna get mad at me? Like what's gonna happen? But if we can get that information from Matt about like whether or not that's an evidence-based program, I thought they did a really good job. And the kids, this was for like the kindergarten, first grade, they seemed to be able to connect the dots between those things.
Cool. All right, so that's it in terms of content that I have for you all today. The last thing that we are gonna do is we're gonna do a little bit of practice with looking at sort of analyzing a curriculum, like one that exists on the internet or like a published curriculum. You could also, if you want, just think about something that you are currently using, whether it's like a published thing or something you and your organization have created. But I want folks to spend at least a little time. I don't think we'll be here till 11:30 unless maybe we'll have discussion that lasts for a while, but I want us to at least spend a few minutes, pick some curriculum and try to analyze it from what, if you're looking at a website, like what information can you get from the website related to the core concepts or the content that we talked about today and last week. Definitely I would focus on like one or two things, like that's a long list of core concepts. You're not going to get through all of them. And if folks does anybody have curriculum in mind or like think you know what you want to look at? I can also give a few examples if
I would appreciate some examples since I'm new to this work.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
So ones that I know you can get, like just from looking at their website, you could get a pretty good amount of information, are Second Step, put these in the chat. And then Prevent Child Abuse Vermont has a bunch of different curricula. I forget on their web, I think it's pretty easy to find on the website, but they've got one that's called like the Healthy Relationships Project. They've got one that's called Safety for Kids or something like that. And then I think we talked about this one last week as well. There's the Our Whole Lives curriculum. There's other ones out there, but these are, if you just want to practice with something, feel free to look these up and go to their website. So why don't I give us like 10 minutes? Folks can just turn off your videos if you want and just like do a little reading, research, think about this. And then we'll come back and talk about what you noticed, what you found, what you couldn't find, stuff like that. All right. So I'll set a timer on my end and I'll let you know when we've got like a minute left. All right, if you want to finish up sort of what you're working on right now and come back. All right, so does anybody want to share what like what curricula you were looking at, and then what you found just from doing a little bit of it, having a little bit of time to analyze it? Yeah, go ahead, Eleanor.
So I looked at the Advocates for the Youth Rights, what is it called? Rights, Respect, and Responsibility curriculum. And it is phenomenal. And it's free. And they have like a teacher's guide, like before you teach, just like a general thing. Yeah. I will send the whole thing right here. They have it available in multiple languages, like all of the curriculum. They have stuff for parents. They have like specific information for like considerations for if you're teaching students with disabilities or disabled students too. And then I was looking through specifically, like it's called like My Space, Your Space, a lesson plan, a K through 12. Like it's specifically for by the end of second grade, they should learn these things. And it's about like consent, because I was looking for this kind of stuff. And I was reading through the curriculum, and it's like very intensive and based on skill based. So I'm very impressed by it. I'm gonna do a lot more digging into it. And I've loved Advocates for Youth for a long time, but I had never found this curriculum before. But I'm very impressed by it.
That's awesome. Yeah, I do not know anything about this curriculum, so I'm going to look at it afterwards. That's great, and great that it's free.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing that they also have supplements and teachers' guides. There's a reference to a maze video, so that definitely strikes me as comprehensive, and that they're taking different audiences into perspective as well.
Yeah, and it says that it's evidence informed, like they use that language specifically, and they had like a section with like a bibliography of like the science behind the curriculum, and how it was like informed to be created. So yeah, go Advocates for Youth. Yay.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing, Eleanor. Anybody else want to share anything you found out, or even just like what questions you still have, like anything you couldn't find out?
I briefly looked at bringing in the bystander curriculum. That is, I use that to inform like a bullying lesson that we do when we talk about bystander intervention. And I do realize that this curriculum is like mostly for college and maybe high school students, but the website doesn't give a whole, they're very like vague about what the program is, and I think UNH does that to try to keep their program their own, which is fine. But they do talk about gender socialization and intersections of oppression. So like focusing on when you're thinking about like how can you intervene, like analyzing, is it safe for you? Like, is it safe for you based on your identity and the person that you're going to need to be confronting? Like, And if not, what are your alternative ways of intervening? Pro-social behavior and skills. I recall from the training I went to, it really encourages participants to think about their own experiences. If they've had an experience where, they wish somebody had stepped in to intervene on their behalf, because I think that really taps into the empathy and compassion for others. And then, of course, bystander information, because it's a bystander intervention training. And again, the safety and risk reduction. So analyzing, how is it going to be safe for me to get in? How is it? How can I create more safety to the person who needs someone to intervene for them? That kind of stuff.
Cool. That's awesome. So that's a really good example of like the curriculum's built on like this one, bystander intervention is the main focus of that curriculum, but it's still touching on all these other like great content areas. That's awesome. And I think it is definitely true that researching curricula, sometimes we run into like, I'm not going to get any more information about this unless I go to a training and like pay for something, which is annoying. Sometimes I think if you email someone, they might send you some more information without needing to like pay for something right away, but it definitely happens that they just want you to buy it, obviously.
Sarah, would you mind sending that in the chat as well, the link to that? Thank you. So I used the time to review the criteria, the notes from last time, and make myself that like very straightforward checklist. And then I also looked at the OWL curriculum. I feel like I didn't really get to go through it systematically, but there were definitely parts that jumped out. It definitely caters to, it has different developmental categories. So K-1, 4 through 6, 7 through 9, all the way up through older adults. So they are considering different audiences. I believe I saw evidence informed in there. I was impressed by the number of sessions. I mean, I went through the adult version, but I didn't necessarily remember exactly how many sessions or what they were. I think from a glance, it seemed to hit a lot of the different content areas, but I would want to like really kind of pull notes and see how many of them they hit. I think it's a lot easier to hit more when you have that many sessions. So I think that would also be a factor to keep in mind, like to what extent is it realistic to implement so many sessions, like, or which sessions hit the content area that are priorities for the target audience, meaning, or the organization. And then would that session stand on its own, or is it based on, like, does it continuously reference back to previous sessions, or can it stand alone? Yeah, so I guess it was more of a review, and I'm a little biased since I've gone through it, so I wouldn't want that to like influence it. And I also enjoyed hearing about these other curricula, so thank you for sharing.
And if folks, if you didn't get a chance to look at the document that I sent last week, the Wisconsin Coalition worked with this. It's called I think it's called Awareness to Action. It's like A2A, this organization, to do like a big curriculum review of, it's not all of, I think Second Step is in there. I think Prevent Child Abuse Vermont is in there. I don't think the one that Eleanor was talking about, I don't think is in there, but there's a bunch of stuff, and they do literally have sort of like tables where they say like, does it hit each of these pieces with like check marks or X's if it does or not. So that's also one sort of easy thing you could look at, and if you're just trying to compare a few curricula directly to each other. But it's really good. I think it's really good to practice this, because certainly not everything is covered in that document, and it's just good to go out into the world knowing like, okay, these are the things I'm going to look for. This is how the kind of research I want to do before we decide if we really want to invest in something or not. Okay, that is it for today. Does anybody have any questions or like lingering thoughts or comments before we go?
Kelsey, can you say the name of that document you were talking about again?
Yeah, let me stop sharing this and I'll definitely email it again, but actually I'm wondering, maybe I didn't send it in the last one. It's called A2A Curriculum Review. And I'll definitely re-email it out to anyone. Maybe I didn't send it the first time. Well, I really appreciate you all for being here again this morning and just for engaging in this conversation and like doing a little practice with it, because this is, I hope, feels useful, and I know some of the stuff we're talking about may feel like this is not how my organization has been doing things, and so now maybe do I need to change that or what? Like I know in some cases it might feel like a big ask to like redo things or pick a new curriculum or whatever. I'm hoping, I'm here for whatever else I can be useful for in thinking about all of this. You know, at the end of the day, we all have the same goal of like less violence in the world. So that's why we're talking about it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Kelsey.
Thank you. Take care.